Our speaker tonight is Dr. Evan Bennett. He's an associate professor of history at Florida Atlantic University in Boca Raton, where he teaches courses in Florida history, maritime history, and labor history. He was born and raised in Tampa and earned his bachelor's and master's in history at the University of South Florida before completing a PhD in history at the College of William and Mary. His most recent book, which we'll hear about tonight, is titled Tampa Bay, The Story of an Estuary and Its People. Thank you, Evan, for joining us. I'll share my screen and hand it off to you.
And there we are. Got my audio correct. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for the invitation to come talk to you about the book. It's been exciting to have this out, and it's been a little nerve-wracking too, because as I was writing, I knew I was not only writing for historians who may not know where Tampa Bay is or barely know where Tampa Bay is. I also knew I would be writing for a lot of different audiences, particularly local audiences. That many of you may have may know things that I don't know, and I'm always happy to learn from your perspectives on Tampa Bay as well. But I appreciate you being here to let me talk about it a little bit. When you go to write the history of a bay, which is where I wanted to start, I certainly didn't. I didn't want to write a history of Tampa or St. Petersburg particularly. I wanted to write the history of the bay itself. But I'm a historian, not a geologist or an anthropologist or anything like that. So I wanted to write about the people that are there, of course. And so there's a lot of ways you can approach doing this. And so ecologically was where I wanted to start. And what I really started with was this question about Tampa Bay in the 20th century. So I grew up there, I was born in the mid 70s, and I grew up, and by the 1980s, Tampa Bay was still talked about as quite polluted. But I knew that that this was a longer history of being polluted, and so here by the 1950s, the smell along Bayshore Boulevard was so bad that it was noxious to people. It could peel the paint on your house because of the sulfur in it. From the rotting algae in Hillsborough Bay. You couldn't swim in large parts of Hillsborough Bay. Had essentially a dead zone, and even in Old Tampa Bay, you had significant beach closures regularly on the Causeway and at Spa Beach and other places. And then in 1970, this was sort of capped off with this, or sort of a salt in the wound with a massive oil spill there at Weeden Island when Florida Power used to have a power plant on the island, and that spill left a sheen of oil, heavy bunker oil, all the way from Weeden Island down to the mouth of Tampa Bay. And so, anyone who would think about Tampa Bay in up through the 1970s and 1980s really would have thought of it as a very polluted bay. And against that, right, we know that Tampa Bay today is much cleaner. I borrowed this from the Tampa Bay Estuary Program's website, and they established in the 1980s, or really in the early 1990s, set as a benchmark for where they would like to see the seagrasses. And the seagrasses, of course, become something of a proxy for the health of the bay. It's not a perfect proxy, but it's a good one. And they established what they thought was the extent of seagrass acreages in Tampa Bay in 1950 at about 40,000 acres, as you can see here. And they'd set as a target to try to get Tampa Bay back to that, knowing that the bay itself, in its natural state, for lack of a better term, right? And I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, was certainly had much larger seagrass beds and had much larger mangrove forests and tidal estuaries and things like that, right? So it has this was a way of just sort of setting a benchmark. And so I started as a historian, which we all love when we're historians. We love to have a starting point and an end point and try to explain how that change over time happens. We had the starting point of the bay was really dirty, and then the bay has gotten cleaner. And so at one level, I decided that that was the beginning of a narrative arc for me. And I could have written that in a number of ways. I could have focused on the policy aspects of it. I could have focused on the the technology parts of this, the science and ecological things. And I knew I wanted to bring some of that into this, but I also, because I also grew up in Tampa Bay, I knew there was a lot more to the story. And in fact, I'm going to correct myself. As everybody in Tampa knows, you don't say you grew up in Tampa Bay, because then you grew up in the water. We've always chastised those national figures for calling it Tampa Bay. But I grew up in Tampa, and I knew that there was a much larger history here, right? So Tampa's not just a ecological spot on a map; it's also a place where people fish, where people boat, where they just simply pull up on the Courtney Campbell Causeway or the Gandy Causeway, and they live their lives in this space, and they have intimate connections with the bay every day, right? And I also knew the bay was a place where lots of people work. The phosphate industry is a really important and massive part of this. The largest, one of the largest phosphate ports in the world, which is also a major source, has been historically a major source of the pollution. But it's also a source of, a site of labor and work, and that interaction as a port was critical to me, both, with the even the shrimpers and the banana handlers and all of the sort of biological transfer that's going through there, through this port. It seemed to be really important. And most importantly, and probably best, that you all as an audience would recognize, this is a long history of human interaction. And so as I was writing, I sort of figured that, this history goes back to before there was a bay, right? So in fact, the first chapter, I can't remember exactly how I put it in the sentence, put it in the first sentence, but it said before there was a bay, there were people. And of course, the human habitation of this space goes back long before the sea level rises that brought us the modern shoreline roughly 2,000 years ago. And so to even talk about the human history of Tampa Bay is to talk about humans being in a space where because of climate changes, because of ecological transformations, people were adjusting over time, and of course building large, complex societies long before any European arrivals. And then throughout that longer history of the Spanish being there, and then the British, and trying to lay claim, and the Americans and the Seminoles, and all of these groups that are around Tampa Bay and using Tampa Bay, whether they're gaining their livelihoods from it, or in the case of the Maroons of say Angola down near the Manatee River, right? They are finding refuge in this space. And so when I decided as a historian, or what I decided as I was going to write this history, was I didn't want to pick up the story simply in 1820 or in 1900 or 1950 or wherever else I might be able to set a sort of marker. I really wanted to be able to tell the long history of Tampa Bay, and part of that is a sort of occupational hazard or occupational habit I've developed teaching here at Florida Atlantic. In many other places, when they teach Florida history, they use these neat little sort of lines of demarcation, right? So I remember when I was at USF, they taught Florida history to 1821 and Florida history since 1821. And we made that sort of break there. And when I arrived at Florida Atlantic, and I was hired to teach Florida history, the course was simply called History of Florida. And so for the last 15 years or 17 years now, I guess I've been here, I've sort of compressed all of Florida history into this one semester. And I'm actually trained as a 20th century historian, or 19th and 20th century historian. And so I gained an appreciation as I had to push myself back in time and learn more about Florida and that earlier history, and figure out how I'm going to teach that. I became much more interested in figuring out how do we make those connections across time. So in Tampa, when I came to write the book, um, I decided, really a long history, even if it means I can only tell it in a sort of relatively shallow way, because I was set with a word limit and all of that from the press. And I'm not an anthropologist or archaeologist, so would be relying on other people's work to tell that earliest part of the story. Um, I decided that I really wanted to push that back, and so that when people think about Tampa Bay, they start, and I'll explain this maybe more in a minute. When people think about Tampa Bay, I want them to think about those really long connections of people living around this bay, right, around this body of water. So one way to think about one way I was thinking when I thought about how to approach telling this long history that at one level was designed to be an ecological history of environmentalists and policy, but also a story about people who live in this place. One thing I return to is a quote that I use in my history classes. Almost all of my history classes, I put this on as a sort of epigraph or epigram there at the beginning of the semester. This comes from historian William Cronin, who taught for a long time at the University of Wisconsin. And Cronin was asked in the mid 1990s, you may remember in the 1990s, they tried to develop sort of national history standards. And there was a big fight over that because historians wanted some people in, and other people thought it should be a more traditional sort of telling of history. And so they asked Cronin in this one venue journal. They asked a number of historians what should be on this agenda for teaching American history. And this one from Cronin always stuck out with me. He says, "What history should our children learn? They should learn what is not at all obvious to them, that people long dead were once profoundly alive." I always start that with my students is, look, this is really important. However far back we go, I want you to remember the humanity of the people we're talking about. They should learn that the past is a place from which we came, each of us arriving in the present via different pathways, even as we and our ancestors eventually found ourselves sharing and sometimes fighting over the common ground we now inhabit together. They should learn that the past is a foreign country, a land whose inhabitants made livings and spoke languages and held ideas far different from our own, indeed so very different that only an act of great historical imagination can help us see the distance we've traveled in our own journey away from their time. And so I use this as a framing device for many of my history classes. And it also works really well for how I approached the story of telling Tampa Bay's history. And the first point, and I think I have 4 points here I want to sort of draw out here of how I approach this. One is the familiar but different. I think that was a really important one in telling this history of a place now where 2 million people live around, that many people have a daily interaction with, and it has a familiarity to them. But of course, the challenge for the historian and anthropologist, archaeologist, all of us who are telling these stories of the human past, is to help people understand that what you might see around you can be that really interesting window into starting to understand, but you really need to sort of set yourself apart and remember that's a different place. And the place that always drives this home for me, and some of you may recognize this place. This is, of course, the Tocobaga Mound at Philippi Park. This is one place I love to drive this message home to people. For many people who grow up in the Tampa Bay area, this is a familiar park. I grew up going here in the 1980s. This is the sort of northeast view into Safety Harbor. When I was growing up, there was more of a beach there. And so you could go down at low tide and play with the fiddler crabs. And you'd be and when you go there now, of course, you're standing on a space that, while looks very different than it would have 500 years ago, right, is a place built by human hands, 700 years ago or something, if we push it back in time. And of course, geologically, we know half of it was torn off in 1848, and it would have stuck, the peninsula there would have stuck out much further. So when I would talk about a place like this to an audience, or when I think about this myself in the book, is there's a familiarity to this. I could stand here and literally standing in the same place that the people of Tocobaga would have stood, right? I'm standing in the same place that Cabeza de Vaca came to. That history happened in this place, and I wanted people in Tampa, especially the way Florida history is often told, right? Is it's only recently, right, that we have a modern, that Florida became anything. I wanted people to understand that you're in the place where this history happens, but you shouldn't think of it as being so close to you in time that it would be instantly recognizable, right? So the mound, of course, is covered in trees today, but it would have been gleaming white at the time that at the time it was the main temple mound for the people of Tocobaga. That it would have looked different, but the experiences, in fact, with the water and experiences with nature also would be different. So while you could have this sort of familiarity and this kind of time connection with that, at the same time, you need to account for the fact that time changes. I put it in the book, no one steps into the same Tampa Bay twice. I could stand as a child, and I did, where Tocobagan children probably played in the water as well. But the context in which they did it and the context in which I did it are very different things. And so one of the features I like to drive home about this is that people should be able to understand they're in that longer history, and but they need to understand that the world, the massive changes happen across that time, and it doesn't even have to be that far back in time to sort of have to visualize a very different world. This is the what today is known as the Garrison Channel. This is just in downtown Tampa. If you're looking, the bridge here, you're looking to the east in this picture, and so the bridge here is the railroad bridge that was there until they took it out when Seddon Island closed. They took out the railroad and they built the bridge that takes you, the eastern bridge that takes you over to Harbor Island today. So where these ships are is roughly where Amalie Arena would be today. Now this picture was only taken in the 1920s, and so it's really not that far ago. So 100 years ago, the Tampa Bay that people look out on or experienced and their experiences with it were quite different than the ones we had today. This was a much smellier bay. This was an industrial workspace, not a tourist destination. People who came to Tampa, often they came via ship, so their experiences of entering Tampa were not like today, where you fly into Tampa International Airport, but your experiences of Tampa Bay were entering at the mouth and sailing north to the harbors. And so that context, again, even in a relatively short amount of time, changes drastically. So I like to drive home that point. The second point I like to drive, that inspired me as I wrote the book, and again, part of the reason I felt like to push it back in time to include its earliest history. I understand why we use the term prehistory, and I just want to understand it as our earliest histories, is to understand the diversity of the experiences around Tampa Bay, and the diversity of the peoples who have come to live in Tampa, came over time, of course, to live around Tampa Bay. Now, normally when I give this to an audience who's less familiar with the history of Tampa Bay, right, I go through the sort of list of everybody who's ever lived here. And of course, if we go back, native Floridians have always lived around Tampa Bay, and lived here, as I said earlier, lived here long before there was a bay. And of course, the Spanish arrive, British arrive. You have these Creeks and Seminoles and others, I like to think of them in some ways that sort of second wave native Floridians who start to come in, and then of course the Cubans and the Spanish Indians who build the ranchos in the late 18th and early into the 19th century. They they are part of that history that has to be told, as are African American Maroons. And then, of course, for the lack of a better term, right, the Americans who start to come in the mid 19th century and really begin to build it up, but also Cubans and Spaniards and Italians who come with the development of Ybor City, and then the Yankee transplants, again, for lack of a better term, who also come here. And in every case, right, everybody, where depending on where they are in time, but even when they overlap with each other, their experiences around Tampa Bay had similarities, in that, maybe how they were fishing or how they're gaining a livelihood from being on the bay, but they also had key differences that could be shaped by race, by gender. Those sorts of characteristics shaped people's experiences around the bay. And so I try to account for those in some ways, because of course, as those people come, some of them come as settlers, looking to plant around here. Others come as fishers, hoping to exploit the bay's natural bounty. And of course, we could make the division between commercial fishers and subsistence fishers and recreational fishers. They're all aiming for something different, right? When they see Tampa Bay, soldiers come, plume hunters, who help to denude the bay of its much of its bird life by the end of the 19th century. They all leave a mark in many ways. The shipping companies and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who turns the bay into this modern functioning port, and then of course developers who build it up, and use. I should put the developers down here actually on Boca Ciega Bay, so that you can, because that's the most visibly obvious place where developers have had a way in shaping this. Beachgoers and boaters, and then environmentalists. Everybody's had a different view with what Tampa Bay should be, how it should be used, where their place in it is. And of course, that leads us to, as Cronin points out in his quote, sometimes there's conflict, right? And as a historian, you kind of want conflict sometimes, because that helps you in your narrative piece of it. Tampa Bay's never been a major site of course, massive conflict, but it has been a site where European empires fought over the space, or at least traded it over tables in Europe sometimes, over who could control it, and who would essentially have domination here. They and native peoples too, struggled for that, for control of it, all the way up into the 19th century with the Seminole Wars. Tampa, of course, I mean, go back on that just a second. Tampa, of course, is the great port of debarkation, or the port of dislocation, it might be a better way to put it, for the Seminoles during the Second Seminole War. And thousands of them leave through Tampa Bay. It's their last site of Florida. And so that history, that sort of, to me, that sort of colored a sadness on that history that has to be accounted for. And then even in the 20th century, right, the struggles over access to the water, most notably in the struggle over segregation at the beaches, highlights the level at which what is a public resource, or what was constructed as a public resource in the area as access to Tampa Bay. And in the book, I go back and make this point, because to me, it's a really interesting one about Tampa, is that for very much of its history, the Tampa Bay area, since the late 19th century, public access has been highlighted for people. So, whether it's the construction of beaches, or access to boat ramps, or the ability to get on the water, the old Gandy Bridge, had the catwalks for fishing. There was a real civic ideal about access to the bay. But there were these striking moments, right, of segregation. This is south, on the left-hand side is South Mole in St. Petersburg, which was set aside for Black swimmers. And then in the late 1950s, rather than integrate Spa Beach. At times, they attempted to simply close it and prevent African Americans from having access. So a lot of this history is one of people experiencing a common resource, but again, through in often very different ways that are shaped by the culture of the time. But I do come back in the book that this is common water or common ground, as Cronin liked to put it. This is a space that people inhabit together and use in various and have those connections with each other. Again, public access being a critical one, and for whether it's for sun and for fun or for fishing or any of those things, it is a place where people found commonality, which is where where in the narrative of the book is where I'm able to bring back in that ecological story. So part of the reason Tampa Bay is gets cleaner is because people began fighting for it in the 1960s, really in the 1950s, with the construction, with the protests against the dredging in Boca Ciega Bay. Those are, unfortunately, they're not able to stop them, and you have the Ratner fill and all of those things that help to transform Boca Ciega Bay. But that sort of began to build an energy for cleaning the bay up, and by the late 1960s. You see the development that merges with this larger national environmental movements. Also, the passing of environmental law at the federal and state levels in response to a greater concern for the environment. Really helps to bring that together. But to me, what was always key to understanding it was in other places, you might have an environmental struggle that's rooted in only one community. And in Tampa Bay, it is largely suburban white folks who are at the kind of core of the center of this movement. But there's a whole raft of people. There's scientists. There's, and in fact, one of my favorite parts of the story to tell in this, and I would tell this as a sort of proud alum of USF, but also the scientists at USF, the scientists at Eckerd, they are both growing universities at that point. And so they're hiring these brand new scientists who all been trained in ecology, and many of whom are experts on estuaries. And so they go out with their boats rather than waiting for a grant. Whenever the Army Corps of Engineers would put out a report and they didn't think it was right, I mean, they would get their boats out and their grad students, and they'd go do the study and go right back to the Army Corps of Engineers and say, no, you're wrong. You need to pay attention to this. And so you have this sort of expert knowledge, but then you have this real passion around the area from keeping the bay cleaner or for getting the bay to be cleaner. And so in many ways, that's what brings this story together to me, was the centrality of the bay to these people's lives and the centrality of it to culture over time really is what helps to animate much of the fight to bring it back. And it still is what is animating so much of it. These are folks who are students who are volunteered with Tampa Bay Watch to put down to help with the oyster beds, to these sort of recovery beds they're trying to create in order to help the to bring the oysters in to help filter the water and to also create a stronger shoreline, stronger natural shorelines. And so at some level, to me, this was a relatively happy story, right? Historians don't always get to end with things are better and they're on the right track. Now, of course, I wrote this book, and unfortunately, we had two hurricanes in the immediate aftermath of this. And my brother blamed me. He said if I'd never written the book, then the hurricanes would not have realized Tampa had not been hit since 1921. And I'll take the blame, I guess. And that has chastened me some, right? That and other reports about seagrasses, the reduction in that, increases in pollution in the water that have been noted. Of course, Piney Point in it was 2021, 2022, there when they had to do the releases at Piney Point because of this sort of industrial ruins of these phosphate processing plants that remain. It chastened me some when I started telling the story. I wanted to tell a relatively, oh, not a Pollyanna story, but a sort of relatively upbeat, and give people some energy for understanding that you can clean up a bay, and those efforts are not for naught. They are in fact really important. But I've been chastened by that, understanding that what gains have been made are still sort of fragile, and we need to make sure that we're still continuing to clean up Tampa Bay. So I guess I should stop sharing here because that's the end of it. I don't see anybody, so that's my thing at the moment. I kind of didn't want to see faces, or didn't want to at least see black screens either, because that reminds me of when I had to teach over Zoom, and that's um, sort of a traumatic memory of seeing nothing but no one's faces. So I'm happy to take any questions. I hope that sort of rounds it out well for you, and I'm happy to talk on more detailed levels too if anybody wants to talk about it. Thanks so much for your attention.
Yeah, and thank you, Evan. Yeah, so usually it works better if you type your question in the chat so we can have some order, but we're also not opposed to having you unmute yourself and ask a question if you'd prefer that method.
I see Kathy's question here. I'll take that. I wish I could see a photo of what Tocobaga looked like. Any images? I do too. There are none. There are none of what it would have looked like, of course, in its original state. The earliest pictures I've ever seen were taken in 1930, and that's when they did. And other people may have earlier ones of this, but in 1930, some archaeologists came, and we'll just say they didn't use the best methods. They just started digging, and where they focused a lot of their digging, in fact, was on the burial mound that lay just sort of northwest of, from my understanding of the site, sort of northwest of where the mound is today. And those remains, those were photographed. The mounds and the remains actually were photographed, and they were published in the Tampa Tribune. And I've not gone back in and dug them back out, but they're sort of horrific. I'm sure from an archaeologist's standpoint, you would have shuddered at this. In fact, I was mentioning earlier to Jamie that when I wrote the first chapter, one of my colleagues who's since passed, Arlene Fradkin, here at FAU, was kind enough to read my first chapter. And I remember talking with her about it, and she sort of shuddered at the thought of how they had done the digs at that point. And I don't know exactly where all of the material went. I've never seen any. Other people may know that better as to where all of that went. I will tell you, excuse me, the reason I had Arlene, and this would be the way to sort of bridge across between anthropology and archaeology and history as a discipline. I had Arlene read the first chapter for me because all of this information I was gaining about the site were from archaeologists' reports about whether, and most of them were relatively older. I'm glad to hear there's new work being done. But so the archaeology that was done at Safety Harbor, archaeology done at Weeden Island, at the Thomas site in southern Hillsborough County. So some of those reports were there, and they're largely right. They're scientific reports of what's found at the site, how the sites are constructed, sometimes bringing in Spanish, descriptions that are the sort of first narrative descriptions we have of these places. But as a historian, the challenge is we want to write with narrative, right? We want to make those narrative linkages, which are always about causation, and so we want to tell that story. And so it was real. really tried to be very careful not to build in narrative in that, particularly in the first chapter, which looks at um, these earliest peoples that live in Tampa Bay. I tried not to impose a narrative on them, but tried to explain their world in a way that accounted for what are we talking, 10,000 years of history, right? In that space, even before Tocobaga's, or even before the modern coastline develops. So trying to account for that history in that way. The great. I'm looking at Rachel's comment. Yeah, poking on the archaeologists sort of sterile. You have to be right. If you do impose too much, and that was my fear. If you start to impose too much, then you've done damage to the historical record. The best thing, I think, the best sentence I ever wrote for that whole front part was, never mistake static objects for a lack of dynamism in the lives of the people who controlled them. Right. So, you don't ever just want to paint that still picture too much. Right. Good. That's great, Kathy. I'm seeing your comment here about the standing on top of the mound and trying to imagine what that was like. Um, the Tocobaga knew they were, and I tell this story a little bit in there, that the Tocobagans knew about the Spanish. Again, you're right, because of the earlier stuff further to the south. And in fact, when the first expedition Narvaez comes, they probably get warning because Narvaez lands near what's now Jungle Prata, and so in his first thing, and so people's there run when they see the Spaniards, according to the Spanish accounts, and so probably the words already got across there. When Menendez comes in 1566, I guess it is, Menendez brings with him Carlos from around Port Charlotte. Uh, Carlos wants him to go to war with the Tocobagans and essentially take them out, and he says no. So they find a translator, but trying to reimagine that world of the 16th century encounters is really great. If you haven't seen it, just to throw this one out here one more time, and I have it. It's the footnote for it's in the book, or in the bibliography. There's a great article on a woman named Madalena, who is captured during the Hernando de Soto expedition. De Soto captures her and then takes her as far north as Tallahassee. And he captured her because he wanted her to be wanted to enslave her for his wife. And so when he gets to the Tallahassee area and his expedition sort of breaks up and breaks camp, some that go back to Cuba take her with them to Havana. When, of course, De Soto's gone and his widow then sails back to Spain, she takes Madalena with her. And Madalena then, when she dies, when De Soto's widow dies, goes back to Havana, and then is part of the Luis Cancer expedition that comes to Tampa Bay. And then she essentially renounces any Catholicism, and goes back to living at Tocobaga. I'd have to look it up, and it would take me a couple minutes, but it's in the footnotes in there. But just an amazing story of trying to imagine how the people of Tampa Bay, what happens to them, right? Once the Spanish arrive, they don't all disappear immediately. Some of them are scattered all over Florida. And in fact, some of the last peoples are known to be around, the last identifiable peoples of the Bay Area would have been found around St. Augustine at some point as this sort of world shifts. So it's an amazing one in there. Favorite characters from the historical research? There's one that I didn't research that story. I use a secondary source for that story, but I have to tell you, just by my favorite person is probably Jan Platt. if any of you known of Jan Platt. Um, and of course, this is the historian geek in me that did this. Jan Platt was county commissioner in Hillsborough County from 1978 to 2003. So a 25-year career as a county commissioner. She was the point person on anything to do with Tampa Bay. So in the 1980s, she helped to oversee the first, or she helped to bring about the first ecological studies of the bay as a bay. They created the Agency for Bay Management based on that, which then became the clearinghouse for all this. But my favorite part of the story about her is that when she retired, the Hillsborough County kept her papers for, I think it was 5 years or 7 years. And then they called her and said they were just simply going to destroy all of her papers, which of course is a nightmare for historians. So she called USF, and Andy Hughes there at the library at USF was able to get a truck and whatever else was needed. She had over 300, I think it was 300 to 400 boxes of just everything she ever collected as county commissioner. So why is she my favorite? Because as a historian, now I had a massive, I think I spent 2 weeks going through just her boxes of everything. She saved every agency on bay management report. Um, um, uh, you know, and so we have all of that. Excuse me. So she's one of my favorites. The other is Roger Stewart, who was the Hillsborough County environmental person. He had the guts in 1974 to take the guys from 60 Minutes out on a boat. And when the county commissioners of Hillsborough County tried to make it sound nice about all the development, he took Mike Wallace up in Baycrest and said, "This is an open sewer," and got fired for it, but then got his job back because everybody else in Hillsborough County fought for him, and he just was acerbic and had attitude. But I see your question here. All the people that you're here before your time, I do go into the first two chapters. The way the book is structured is I tried to think about people's relationships with the Bay, understanding there's several kinds of relationships that have always gone on, right? So people have looked at the Bay as a place for food. So the first chapter is called Larder, which considers the peoples of the Bay up until really the arrival of the Spanish. And so I dig into that history, going as far back to Paleo Indians as far back as we can, and then bringing that up through through the Weeden Island folks, through the Minnesota, through the Safety Harbor peoples, trying to give a sense of at least the historical progression as we could tell that story. Again, it's one we tell in pieces at times about this, but understanding that every one of those groups developed complex societies around the Bay that centered on what it could provide for them, right? So, corn agriculture is not really a thing, even for the Safety Harbor peoples, sort of south of or from Tampa Bay north, sort of it is, but as late as the 16th century, not really there. So they rely so much on the Bay. So I centered their story of their relationships as hunters or as fishers, as existing in that space. Also, the ecological changes they go through, right? As we find some sites that are further out, and then other sites that are closer in with relation to the water. So we know they're adjusting to those in all of those ways. And then the second chapter is called Borderland, and Tampa Bay has been from the beginning a space where different cultures meet, whether that's native cultures who are meeting at Tampa Bay and trading in Tampa Bay. That was one of the most fascinating things, and I want to learn more about this. People finding whelk shells from Tampa Bay and doing that sort of DNA analysis of whelk shells, I guess, up into Ohio and to Southern Illinois, right? Those trade networks always put Tampa Bay, even before the Europeans ever get here. And then through that second chapter, I attempt to look at the sort of transformations of native peoples who lived around the bay and Europeans as well. So in the by the 18th century, we know the groups that would become the Seminoles, or Creeks, or their Seminole, or their Miccosukee, or their whatever. It's unclear in definition because the Spanish simply describe them as Indians. We know by the 18th century they're coming around Tampa Bay to hunt. Some great descriptions of Seminole hunting techniques can be found here. The use of deer skins with using the movable ears to make it look like real deer, and those were great descriptions. Um, they don't use the bay though as a sort of permanent space. It's a hunting space that becomes available to them as the original native Floridians populations decline. And so they move in the 18th century. And we know, in fact, I shared this I have a Facebook page for the book, if any of y'all are interested. And occasionally I share things that I found from the research. But there was a census done in 1822, a sort of rough census of where all the Seminole towns were, or all native towns were. And so we know that there were several. There's Watermelon Town, which is described about as being up against Tampa Bay on the coast, and there's several, about 4 or 5 towns of Seminole towns that were around Tampa Bay at that point. So those folks are here, as are the fishermen, who are Cuban fishermen who start arriving really in the late 18th century. They begin building these ranchos along the coast, particularly at the mouth of Tampa Bay, but all the way up to Spanish Town Creek, which is up on Bayshore Boulevard, has been filled in since. It's not, the creek itself doesn't exist anymore. But the right there on Bayshore Boulevard would have been one of the ranchos as well, and they fished for mullet. They fished for really whatever they could get, but mullet was the chief thing they wanted, because they would salt it and then salt the roe and send it back to Havana. And so as early as the 1780s or so, you have these fishermen, and those communities remain, again, excuse me, until the Second Seminole War. You have these vibrant Floridano communities that are really in this area. So that's one of the things, and I'm glad you've asked about that, because that's one of the things I wanted to highlight to people. Is sometimes our story of Tampa Bay is, well, Henry Plant arrived with a railroad, and all of a sudden, boom, here's a town. And at some level, that's kind of true. I mean, the population growth really doesn't start until the railroads arrive. But there were people here, and interacting with each other, and not necessarily even on sort of a remote island sort of a way of thinking about it. Even if there wasn't a railroad, they were intimately connected to Cuba. They were intimately connected to other places. We know the Seminoles sailed their boats to Havana, sailed boats to Havana, and had interconnections with the Spaniards well up into the 19th century. And Tampa was often one of those. Excuse me, Tampa Bay was often one of those ports. So I'm glad you asked that question. Thank you. Y'all stop me too if I start rambling. I will just go on and on and on. So, anyone know of really good sites about and I'm not going to be able to go back and rewrite the book, but any good sites that I should, or work on the area that's being done archaeologically? I don't know, and I understand, not even, we're not even talking, we don't even have to be talking about really old archaeology, but newer archaeology that's revealing things about this place.
I
Go
will
ahead,
say,
Rachel.
I was just gonna say, was it a few months ago we had, I'm trying to remember his last name, David, who just wrote the book about the Seminole ranches. Jamie, do you?
David Rahahiti Webb, the Spanish Seminole. Um,
Yeah.
it's a book that came out, I think, last year.
Okay.
Yeah, so that was a really interesting research. So um I'm probably gonna mess up some of these details, but his he has Seminole lineage, and he was looking into, who was actually working at the ranchos, and he was able to find some um, baptism records
Hmm.
from Havana that kind of helped him link his family and other Seminole families to like working in the ranchos and things like that. So that was really great to hear that talk, and that was I've known of ranchos and looked at some of the archaeology of them for years, but he brought some information up that I wasn't aware of. So that was really a really cool connection to make.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Yeah, in terms of other archaeological research going on in Tampa Bay too, there's been a lot of work recently at Fort Brooke and the surrounding Garrison neighborhood,
Hmm.
mostly by a cultural resource management firm now named Stantec. But they've been learning a lot about the early 20th century Tampa Bay. And there's been a lot of research ongoing at the Safety Harbor site, Tocobaga, as well as other sites. Weeden Island has had probably a decade plus now of research, and Cockroach Key, Harbor Key, Shaw's Point was studied by the National Park Service, I guess 20 years ago now, 2006. Um, but yeah, it's all we're learning a lot. Every year there's kind of more information about the indigenous Floridians here in Tampa Bay.
Yeah, it's a history that's not especially well known, right? And hopefully we can bring more of that out. Down here in South Florida, of course, right? Because there's such a large Seminole and Miccosukee presence, that connection is more in people's minds, I think, than in the Tampa Bay area. In fact, many people probably wonder, why is there a Seminole hard rock here, and all of that, and why is there a Seminole reservation and all of that up there. So it's less familiar, I think, and particularly that pre-Seminole history needs to be better told in a lot of ways. That's great. You mentioned Cockroach Key. That prompted me to think of my other person that I really found as a fascinating guy, and is again a 20th century person. And some of you may know him, a guy named Gus Munich, who was one of the people who helped to save Cockroach Key and press the state to protect all of Cockroach Bay. He was a fisherman, worked for the telephone company in his regular job, was a fisherman, crabber, and sort of professional um, activist. I mean, maybe a good way to put it. He described in an interview that he didn't really think much about things until of the 1980s, and he sort of realized how bad and how much pressure the development was putting. So every time they're like when Tico wanted to build a new plant down at Cockroach Bay, he like first in line, and he creates these agencies. Essentially, he creates all these activist groups essentially in his living room, and would write letters to every commissioner, every politician he could imagine. In Tallahassee, they would have Tampa Bay Day. And so he would bring up shrimp and mullet and other things and cook it for all of the people to celebrate Tampa Bay Day. Any politician that or wanted to know anything about the Bay, he would take them out on his boat. And so that sort of, in recognizing the not only the ecological value, but the historical value of those sites, really put people or really helped to preserve some of that. So sorry,
Yeah.
hello, I have the cleaning people. I'm in my office at work, so I forgot to put something on the door. So, hey.
Yeah, I just wanted to also add to your other point about the Seminole. I think Rachel's maybe also commenting on that. Regarding fieldwork, they are also active in the Tampa Bay, and especially at Egmont Key, which kind of touch on is a dark history for them, but also kind of the nexus or kind of the point when the Seminole tribe of Florida and Seminole tribe of Oklahoma kind of split. So it's kind of a very important and
Mhm.
sad time in their histories at Egmont. And Egmont Key is, quickly vanishing. So I know there's been a lot of efforts to just map and 3D document as much as they can.
That's
Um, and just kind of to your other points in the book itself, and how you're talking about fragile ecosystems and how Tampa Bay, the estuary, has never been there's never been an estuary without people actively harvesting oysters or fish or doing something, and challenging the idea of a pristine landscape or seascape, and kind of the importance of history and archaeology in these discussions, and how our interpretations and our data are being used by modern managers, not necessarily to try to revert back to, a baseline that is impossible to go back to, but just to provide context, because you can't really understand where you're going without understanding where you've been, right?
mhm.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Historians environmental historians particularly push back on that notion of a pristine nature, and I wanted to do that. I was hoping, I mean, hope against hope, right? I've seen those reports of the further south of those development of sort of fish catching areas and building, and I'm like, oh, why couldn't they have found one of those in Tampa Bay so I could just uh, push that into this story? I know something like that had to have existed, right?
We're
But it's,
working on
yeah, it's
it.
that proof, right? So, um, great. So, yeah, I appreciate the time to talk about this. Um,
Absolutely. And we appreciate your time. Any last minute questions? Dennis, you might, it looks like you might have,
Oh, yeah.
there.
Can you hear me now? Okay,
Yep.
yeah, you had mentioned interesting archaeological sites around Tampa Bay, and I wrote a thesis on a place called Mill Point that's at the mouth of the Alafaya River.
oh,
And there
okay.
was a mound there. It was documented by Clarence Moore, an early archaeologist in 1900, but then the mound was removed around 1910 to build a causeway across the Alafaya.
Hmm.
But yeah, that's a really interesting site. It's got thousands of years of history, and it operates as a county park now, but there's no signage or anything that explains what used to be there. But
Oh,
yeah, if you send me your email, I can maybe send you a copy of the thesis and you can look it over. It's got some
oh,
interesting material on the history, and it extends up to modern history because I included the impact of the phosphate industry on what happened to the estuary of the Alafaya River. And and it's kind of amazing because if you just go there and look, you'll just assume, oh, well, this is the way the river always looked. But what
hmm.
you see now is entirely different from what was there 100 years ago.
That's great. I'm glad to learn about that. My next project is to think is a pro well, one of my next projects is I'm going to be looking at phosphate flows in Florida, and so thinking about we're one of those states with two, but we get phosphate in both directions, right? So we get it both in the mining and in those districts, and then we also get it as a fertilizer problem. And so I'm trying to conceptualize how I want to do this, the sort of history of phosphate that thinks about those flows. And the Alafaya, of course, is so important. So it's going to probably be one of those rivers I try to maybe even write a chapter about on that. So I'd be really interested to see that.
Okay.
And thinking about the Alafaya as a space. I'm sort of thinking about focusing a few chapters on different rivers. So the Peace River and the Alafaya would be two that are critically important for understanding that history of phosphate and its impact. I don't know how I'll work it in yet. So that's great. And I'm glad you brought up that point too. It's such a sad thing. You want to go back, that the mounds are there. There's 20, the number is 20 something that were around the Tampa Bay area as late as the early 20th century, right? And you're like, oh, if you guys had just not built roads, if you could have just waited to build the roads, you could have done modern studies of these places. And it's so sad to think of how all that is so scattered everywhere except from a few sites.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you, Tracy. I appreciate that.
Okay.
All right. Thanks. And I'm happy to talk with anybody who wants to talk about Tampa Bay. As I said, it's weird sometimes when you're a historian and you go off. I went to graduate school at William and Mary, just because on a suggestion, and I thought I'd never come back to Florida, and then of course it sucks you back in, and so it's weird to write about a place you know intimately, not as a historian but as a sort of civilian, right? It's your own place, and as I said, it makes you nervous because anytime I would write about any place, I would get the maps out to make sure I understood the geography as well as I thought I understood the geography. And I had to relearn, especially Southern Hillsborough County or parts of Pinellas County that I'm not as familiar with, because I grew up in Town and Country, so up in the old Tampa Bay part. I can remember when Upper Tampa Bay Park opened, and that was my sort of first memory of access to the water there. So that and the Courtney Campbell Causeway and Ben T. Davis Beach, those were my spaces. So appreciate everybody.
Yeah, thank you again for your time. Thank you everyone for attending. Yeah, great talk. Hope I know you got at least one book sale out of it.
Awesome. I love to hear that. I love to hear that. I just love to hear that people are reading it.
Yeah.
I put a lot of work into this with the idea that I wanted people there to get something out of it. So great.
Well, thanks again. Have a great night, everyone.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good night.
Thanks. Bye-bye.